Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Disc Guidance segment with the 2MK team. Good thing we did the challenge chat because we did have a few problems, but it seems to be resolved now, and we are going into our explanations of our Dan bot, which is basically mostly completed. As I bragged yesterday on our Dead or live stream, I got this pretty much right early on, which makes it a lot easier to talk about it and get it fully described after just 1 week. If you're not familiar with the general flow of these streams, we spend some time discussing why the bot is the way it is and some of its goals in the broader sense, then go into some minor stuff against the CPU to show off the difference, moving into the actual inputs you need for the bot, at which point we're mostly going to go into talking about how it's helpful, and if you just came to figure out how to input it and how to make sure it's correct, you can probably head on out. We will be discussing some variants, but we're going to discuss the variants themselves pretty early in, and we won't necessarily be putting a lot of effort into showing off the precise parts of those variants. In this particular bot, they're not terribly meaningful. But you can stick around to see that later on. These streams tend to be a bit shorter than our usual, but in this case I expect it to be a little longer than recent ones, mainly because Dan is very interesting in specific ways, and what exactly he's capable of doing depends a lot on his V trigger and V skills. Without us actually going into a lot of that, you won't really necessarily get everything. We're turning the recording playback info on, and here we go. We'll be rotating through multiple people on the controller to demonstrate different things. But the basic understanding is that this bot is partially here to help you get used to the new V-shift mechanic. He fortunately has a V trigger that does a good job of this. Even if you're just getting used to pressing the buttons to do the input timings and getting used to your timings after it. Whereas with our other bots, it tends to be a bit more random. We're fortunate enough that he has a move that does the job quite well. Some other important things about Dan as a generality are frame data, and 1 or 2 specific trolling strategies that you'll see probably at the levels at which we generally suggest bots are used for the matchup reasons. So we'll be discussing those later on as well. It's a relatively simple bot in terms of its purpose. It's a relatively complicated bot in terms of how to input it. You're going to be holding a lot of weird buttons. The motions aren't so bad, but the timings are kind of rough and much more precise than usual. So expect to be putting a lot of effort into getting this bot in, but there are variations you can use that will be easier. The current version is the most difficult one. The one you're watching on this screen is the most difficult to input, and therefore the one that we'll be using for most demos. We may change certain stuff later on, but since the things that are not so hard are relatively obviously both easier to input and less meaningful for full training, i.e. you'd want to upgrade to this as soon as possible, we're not necessarily going to be spending the time to input them and then have to switch them back. One of them you will see some difference later on, but I'll explain why when it comes to the points of precise input stuff. The main thing DanBot is trying to do is obviously taunt, be annoying, teach you Dan's frame data, and take advantage of a couple of the really important design decisions they made for this character. So while he will overdo some things, generally you're expected to have by now faced some other bot at some point. Mostly, you'd have built up some other skills, and this one is just for picking up new ones more or less, and getting used to very, very specific small things about this matchup. With V-Skill 1, Dan's strength becomes very high and somewhat confusing mobility. If you've been having trouble with people trying to escape from you in this game before, well, if any of them become Dan players, expect to be even more frustrated. He is really good at getting out of range, he's really good at doing confusing things, his back dashes particularly, I can't even tell if it's good or not. Like, if you just look at the numbers, it's good. If you look at the distance, it's fairly good. The startup and where he can be hit while backdashing definitely seems good, at least almost on Ed level. And so, you spend a lot of time with this character being able to get away from you, and then threaten you from fairly far away despite his Gadukin being a short attack. He's got some other good options like that. You now see his lunging stand heavy punch being quite good. His jump attacks are also good, and the ability to basically manipulate the frame data of his Dankukyaku, the flying kick you're seeing. Even that stand heavy kick, it's kind of deceptive. It's not necessarily that it's further than most stand heavy kicks, but he doesn't really extend his hurt box very much in the beginning. There's a lot of very small things they went through to make this character a specific type of good. If you are into the sort of character that's really good at getting away from people doing stuff, well, you can see why this character is friends with Blanca. But a larger part of the reason why the bot is like this, why it's okay for it to be this repetitive, why it's okay for it to be this trolly annoying without you having to deal with a whole bunch of Dan pressure and special attacks and stuff, is related to the fact that you have the CPU, and while we don't generally suggest that the CPU should be used as a training opponent just immediately, it can be very difficult to learn certain things. Once you've fought this bot even a little bit, switching to the CPU can show you a lot more of why the things you want to stop or want to do don't work exactly as you'd expect. So let's go ahead now and switch to CPU, and we'll set it to 7 as we always do. Nothing to change here. Now, again, the CPU is usually not strong. It's not doing sensible things, it's not doing particularly strong things. In fact, most of what this does doesn't give the impression much that this character could be strong. Because to come up with a whole AI based around the specific way that players are likely to mess with you playing Dan could be a little odd. And it also is partially because as a core design, his physical moves, even though they can be put together in good ways, are meant to be somewhat goofy, to make him seem weaker, to make him seem as if he's not being serious. So you only really have to worry about things like the Dankukyaku, one of which is basically safe. The others are variable in terms of how dangerous they are, and so on. More importantly, if you would like to train against his V skill 2, then you can do so more easily against the CPU. So after this round ends, or just now, let's go with that now because it's already far enough in. We'll switch it up to his V skill 2. We'll leave him with V trigger 1 and get back to V trigger 2 later. given this move, we're back to bot at the moment, but we'll switch it to CPU now. The special function of Dan's V-skill taunt here is to let him cancel the beginning of moves, which is a relatively advanced technique. In fact, I'm not expecting you to see a lot of it in low to mid-level play. It can be used quite well if you're really serious about trying some specific types of combos, but it's not really that helpful if your opponent defends for long enough or knows what they're doing. Therefore, the goal of our bot is to get you to the know what you're doing part, so that even if you do face someone who does this sort of thing, you're not actually going to be worried if you see the V-skill 2 being the thing that they chose. Since he loses most of his mobility in this form, it'll depend on your character, but not a lot. Basically, if you're used to seeing, hey, that kick should be something that I get to do something after, and he presses the V skill and changes that so it's not true, he technically still must do this in a way that you were probably still blocking. So you see it already sort of showing here. Unless you're fairly used to a bunch of Dan's frame data, the CPU is also going to be confusing in other ways because it's not usually repetitive enough, its spacings aren't really set up to teach you much, and so on. You see more or less the biggest option it grants here, namely that his stand medium kick becomes cancelable. And I definitely expect there to be certain players that are capable of making good use of that, given that it's a decent neutral move in the first place. We actually very slightly incorporated this into the bot, but it kind of doesn't matter a lot because the bot doesn't do stand medium kick all that often, and the chances of it actually successfully doing the cancel in question and doing anything useful from it are relatively small. Developing a bot that could do this is on the agenda, but is not likely to come out with a good one given how it works. So, what is the main purpose of this one? Your goal is to generally hit your crouch medium kick or crouch medium punch and hit Dan usually after he's done something. You're going for the hit confirm, basically hit confirm training, specifically somewhat focused around whiff punish. This ties into one specific thing about him, namely that his Dan Retsuken, the punch you don't see the CPU use, is in fact relatively easy to punish, but also, if you've gotten to fairly mid-levels, also looks like the startup of his dash just a bit. So if you're used to forward movement, meaning I should immediately hit a button, it can lead to bad things where you specifically get baited into doing this by him doing the, in this case, medium Dan Retsuken, and you getting caught because you decided, I'm going to try to stop you from reaching me. Other than that, the point system, which doesn't actually rely on punishing the Dan Retsuken at all, is about getting used to the V-shift, both from your side and Dan's side, and learning various punishes and odd behaviors or spacings of the kick you see him using now, which you can sort of learn from the CPU. But it'll be a while and you'll be able to understand why it is that we consider that still important enough to put in the bot, despite that. The CPU is not great at using this move. And of course it seemed like it might be difficult to come up with a bot that does it better, but I managed barely, so you can use it a little more effectively than just waiting for the CPU to just randomly throw this move out and you try to punish it. We'll turn on the attack data in this case though, because it's going to be somewhat important. Now I know that not everyone can catch what is going on, so I'll just let you know when I'm seeing it. We're going to be watching Dan's side, the frame data. All you care about is after Dan does a kick and is blocked by Jury, what color are the numbers you see? In this case, -2 is a common thing. -4 is a different common thing. But the move isn't that simple. Much like a Tatsu and specific uses of a Tatsu, you can get different values for this. And when you do, it tends to get in the way of you building up a proper punish, especially because, well, they're relatively safe moves to begin with. In fact, the light one is outright advantage to Dan's side. Technically, when we say punish it, and that was an error in our Twitter, it's my fault, we don't so much mean that you actually punish the move, because if your opponent's playing decently well, this move is safe and you don't really get a strong punish if it's the medium one. It's more so you're supposed to either get out of the way or whiff punish the move. Dan's general playstyle therefore is again similar to Blanca, doing a lot of things that you can't actually punish easily. Whereas Blanca, it's actually fairly minus and you're far away, Dan is getting close up through various methods, but you can sort of stop him from getting there in the first place. This is why the hit confirm is important. When you do press an attack and attempt to check your opponent, where they're going to try to get an advantage by doing the move and hoping that you wouldn't try to punish properly. Because there are reasons why you might not punish, which are again not being really demonstrated by the CPU. When Dan is only -2, he can use his EX uppercut to get out of situations. Most characters can in fact sort of backdash the Dankokyaku and still get a punish, which is odd, but it's not as if you can just backdash the move once it's hit you, so it's not really concerning from the Dan player side if they're being fairly serious about it. In short though, you don't want him using this move too much, but it's really not easy to stop him. He has relatively better frame data than most characters in terms of specials. One interesting thing you can do though, which I will now have our jury attempt, is to just try to catch him with the crouch medium kick anyway, because oddly, you can knock him out of the startup of that move a lot more often than you'd think. It's a matter of your spacing being right so that you're not really in danger of the Dankokaku in the first place. And that's where his stand medium kick comes in and starts to really help him out. Another good option is to just go for throw. But for now, let's move on to actually looking at the inputs one by one. And explaining why they are the way they are. Dan's action 1 is relatively difficult to record. I'm going to turn off the attack data this time. It's also relatively hard to see when I'm playing it back this way, so I should change this so that you can see it properly. We suggest that in order to record this input, you set one button to triple punch. If you use a pad, try a shoulder button because they're easier to hold down while you're doing the full recording. And one medium kick button, probably on the face, it doesn't matter. If you use an arcade stick, do what suits you best. Your aim is to press those two buttons at the same time so that you see, which you can only barely see on the screen right now. I should probably move. To a better as part of this stage, so you can see the inputs a little better. Or let's just do this one in two parts technically, because it's not terribly complicated. Hit the buttons like this and hold up forward. On an arcade stick, this is reasonably easy to do cleanly. On a controller, you probably would for once want to use the analog stick to do this, just because of the speed that it needs to be done at. Once you've done that one, you input a backdash afterwards. And it doesn't matter if you flick it a bit too many times, he doesn't tend to backdash twice. This is followed by either a half circle forward or a quarter circle forward. It doesn't really matter which of those two things you input. Remember, you must hold down the triple punch button the entire time, including while you're pressing the options button to end the recording. This is to allow what we call the edge shift. You'll note that while this is replaying into itself, you don't see the triple punch again. As long as the triple punch is held down, the game will not register that the triple punch has ever been pressed. It just considers it that Dan has been holding it down indefinitely. If I let this play, as far as the game is concerned, Dan is holding down the triple punch the entire time. He's not ever let go of it. If you see it in your recordings, you let go while pressing options, and that's going to be a problem. The kick, on the other hand, is let go, which is why you can put it on a face button or just not care too much. Whichever part of your hand you use to press the options button, it should probably also be the one that presses the medium kick. Now, this does not result in a move by itself, but when left completely alone, if Dan has enough meter for it, I'll poke him and make sure he does, what he will actually do is V-shift. V-shift was given priority over your V skill, meaning that if you press medium punch, medium kick, and heavy punch all at once, you will get V-shift instead. You can solve this for your own gaming by pressing a direction, assuming that your V skill doesn't have different versions with direction and you want a specific one, but any direction will work, either forward or backward, if this ever matters to you. The point is technically that if you give Dan just the right timing, he will actually do his stand medium kick, and he will probably loop it for a bit. But because the rest of this input is relatively long, his V skill 2 in later recordings and later options won't actually cancel that into anything. The purpose of that input is just to give Dan a jump and a backdash. The triple punch helps mainly because it gives him V-shift, but those are the goals of input 1. The ability to V-shift, the ability to use heavy punch moves and possibly quickly recover. Sometimes, if you don't have enough meter, it will cause him to do a taunt, I believe, and to put in a jump and a backdash. Depending on the timing, the jump will not result in a jump attack, and you can spend a lot of time fixing this one way or the other. You can also try putting in a different setup for this where you are doing more of a quarter circle input in a specific way to result in an uppercut, but we're going to get back to that because it's a really complicated way that that uppercut happens. Let's look at action 2 in more detail now. It has a similar issue where you're holding a button for a certain amount of time. It's really simple. It's actually as short as you see on the screen, the first 4 inputs on the right side. It is down forward plus V skill button, but in this case you're not actually going to press the V skill button. You can use the V skill button, but I'll get back to why in a minute. When you're trying to get this input in, you just hold down forward while recording with this interval setting set to 1. So you'd come out of this screen with 1 second of recording, pre-recording time waiting for you. But the game does not treat just inputs as recording, just directional inputs. It does not force the recording to start. When it says button input, it means either a change from wherever it was where it started, or an actual attack button. So you can set this to 1, hold down forward, and it will not start recording until you hit the buttons that go with that down forward, yet it will still register the down forward motion, or rather the down forward input. If you flitch to either side and end up wiggling to press forward slightly or down slightly, it will in fact start recording. So just try to relax as much as possible in the down forward position on your stick or pad, and then just do a quarter circle backward from there. And that's it. The complicated part of this input is that you must hold down the medium kick this time. And the result of that will be that he will do only the medium punch, and the quarter circle back will result in a medium punch as a move, the medium Dan Retsuken. Note as before, he does move slightly forward during this, and it can be slightly annoying when it mentally overlaps with the dash. The range on this move also causes, for example, if you thought Dan was going to dash from here, and you went to hit a button, if you were fast enough, or went, okay, I must hit this button, you'll usually, as you just saw, whiff in front of Dan's face and then get punched. When this works with other things, he'll just do his down forward taunt, but if he were in the correct version, this causes him to roll forward. There are various reasons why this is useful, and it's slightly less common than the others for various other reasons. Namely that if you were using action 1 as well, he won't always roll forward. Sometimes he will do stuff like that. We've mostly made the uppercut relatively rare by using this method but any proper quarter circle forward on the first thing, followed by this down forward, has some properties in which it can lead to the uppercut. especially if you're moving around a lot. So the purpose in this case is just to set up a quarter circle back motion to allow for a lot of other things to work later, and to have that down forward medium punch sometimes to assist in uppercuts. Action 3 is also relatively simple, but it does involve once again holding a button. This is just hitting the V trigger button, but again, you can't hit the V trigger button, you must hit at least the heavy kick on some button you can hold. You can still hit the V trigger button if you're not certain that you'll get it, but that must be the button you're attempting to release. So press heavy punch plus heavy kick, then hit throw, and then do forward to down and end instantly. If you've held the heavy kick button for the entire time, you will get what you're seeing here, only the heavy punch will register on the next cycle of this input, and Dan will just do a standing heavy punch. If your character does not care about Dan's standing heavy punch at all, and there are a few, you can in fact be better off with him not even doing this, and just whiffing throw in neutral, because it changes his timing. But it matters quite a bit because characters that don't have particularly long crouch medium kicks or similar can actually be kept out somewhat by this move, and would also want to practice with punishing it, because he does extend his leg a bit forward so that you can hit him while not necessarily being in the range of the move itself. This is very hard to learn though. Dan does slowly move forward while doing this, so you also have to be able to very carefully get your own spacing right, and if not, you get punched. You can use this by itself if you just want to practice dealing with this move, but again, if your character has a long range or just doesn't have a reason to play footsies against Dan in this way, feel free to hold the entire V trigger button in this case. That forward to down is intended in very specific situations to result in Dan being able to again use the uppercut. But it won't come up usually because there's no way for him to not end up just taunting instead, normally. Most of the time he will taunt instead, and there are only very, very specific situations where he won't. It's also difficult to clarify what exactly those are because they have to do with defense positions. The game will allow the uppercut from certain positions where it won't allow the taunt, and similar things. If you would like Dan to use his medium uppercut more often, you can attempt to resolve this in different ways, but for now, this is among your better options. Advanced users of bots can try changing the ending of Action 1 for the ending of Action 3 and see what it gets you. But we won't be going into that detail on this stream. Action 4 is relatively similar. You are holding a button and then doing some motions. It is once again a quarter circle forward, with a light kick as the button you are holding. This is another good place to throw in a medium kick if you want to, but it messes with something else later, so you might want to hit it and then dash and then hit the medium kick during the dash, and then you have to hold the medium kick. All of this to get the uppercut, which if you've used our other bots, you probably just know how to deal with uppercuts. His isn't particularly complicated to deal with. This is here purely so that Dan has a good forward dash. The light kick being held generally prevents him from just doing a throw immediately after the forward dash, but because Action 3 doesn't actually press the throw until slightly later, there is a timing where Dan can dash up and go for something. But usually he will just throw this Hadouken instead. If you consider it very important to get used to Dan's dash up throw, once again, you can start changing around the end of this input to see what you get. But we actually want the throw to be something that happens unexpectedly, that he's not just dashing up and trying to throw you. We have other bots for just dashing up and trying to throw you. Much easier to input than this one too. Dan's benefit for just dashing up and throwing out this fireball is a little hard to explain. But you'll see it when we once again play it in full. And finally, Action 5. Once again, you are holding some weird button combinations. In this case, I've left the plink in, the plink being pressing one button so quickly that it registers on the next frame with any other buttons you hit subsequently. I've left it in to demonstrate that this is okay in this direction, and by direction I mean that the heavy kick was first. This one is done the same way as Action 2. You can hold the down back direction with the button input recording set to interval 1 as mentioned, and just hold it until you see it ready to record, and then your aim will be to press the opposite, a triple kick button and medium punch. But in this case it's much harder because the only part of this you actually want to hold is a heavy kick. So we have found it best to set a triple kick button, set a shoulder button or something similar on a stick to heavy kick, and of course your medium punch button, and hit all 3 of these buttons as best you can, and then hold the heavy kick button, and which is why it is relatively likely that you will get this sort of plink, and if you do, it's okay, because the one thing you care about is that the first frame of this is specifically the heavy kick. Unlike others where we would care about holding the medium kick or holding the medium punch so that you end up with things being pushed out of it, the edge shifts working. In this case, it's absolutely fine to do it the other way. The other inputs where we hold things like medium punch aren't really going to contribute that much here. We don't care that it doesn't work exactly as you'd expect it to. This is the way that you often get Dan to actually jump properly, which I don't really know why this works this way, because his timing should be the same most all of the time, but he has enough changes in his rhythm that it will work out. You will probably have a lot more issues with this because it has to be recorded a specific way, and I myself spent a long time doing it despite knowing exactly what it was supposed to look like. Unfortunately, this input doesn't really have a simpler version. You can definitely manage if it's on the first frame all at once. It very slightly enhances things. But more or less, he's going to do most of the things required relative to this input either way. The EX Dankyaku happens from here. The back rolling taunt, which is super important, happens from here. And mainly what you'd benefit if the input itself, the full thing, was a first frame input, is that he'd do the back rolling taunt less, which is neither here nor there for most people. The input itself, though, is again down back with all those buttons, back to down to back again. And it doesn't matter if you miss one or two diagonals in the process of this. If you find that for whatever reason yours does the back roll too much for your purposes, or you have a character where you for some reason believe that Dan is not likely to want to back off from you, then you should try to record it so that there is no plink. And if you are the sort of person who is constantly frustrated by people having to chase people down and feel as if this character will give you nightmares and incredible irritation, you might actually want to specifically try to get this so that he does the back roll a lot. But for the most part, the back rolling taunt will come up more often off the ends of two specific things where you don't actually care. We may go into what this looks like later on, but first, more demonstrations. As I noted, this stream is probably going to be longer purely because I decided to make sure to explain a lot of the edge shifting aspects and similar this time around, whereas normally I just send people to read the glossary and hope it works out. This one has a little more nuance in what will happen if you don't get them right. And it's difficult from just what we normally have on our page to know how it's supposed to look. Even within what you're about to see, with the bot playing out fully, it still isn't likely to be easy to figure out where things will change if you do it. If your character has extremely long range, you can in fact use his V trigger 2 and just ignore the point system related to the Gadoken. In this case, you can also do that if you're just used to him enough that you probably don't care at all, or you're used enough to V-shift that you don't care at all from your own side. But if you're learning how to time this mechanic, it can help to end up confident in it by not mashing it due to these things. But because the charge Gadoken is actually so long, you can of course just hit him out of it. We have no intention of changing this within the bot, with the general idea being that you still have to get used to the idea of it, because your opponent might put you in a situation where they're charging up the move and you are not able to do something for any number of reasons, unable to do something about it. You could be just outside of the range, which is actually where we suggest most of the practice for this from. Some characters could just instantly react and do something to him, but he doesn't have to charge it in a binary way. He doesn't have to charge it just fully or not at all. He does have in-between levels of charge, and they can frustrate you. So, you should definitely consider his options here. But if you're fairly used to that move and don't need help with V-shifting, you can feel free to change him to V-trigger 2. We do in general suggest that for the bot, you do your training with V-skill 1, and if you really want to train with V-skill 2, you leave that to the CPU. Because it's going to do a lot more of the close range stuff that will matter for this anyway. As you can see here, he's relatively commonly using the back roll. but not completely spamming it. Thing is that he's approximately equally likely to use it in both cases because, again, those things where you're holding the button that would prevent the taunt are also scenarios where he would probably do another move anyway. And if you're familiar with these bots, as a generality, you'll know that because there's a lot of negative edge stuff involved here, you'll get moves that you might not necessarily have been expecting when moving from one to the other, simply because a button is released at the end of an input and another is not released, or something like that. Dan's throw in this form is relatively hard to tech and extremely rare. Mostly for the same sorts of reasons. So with the back rolling taunt, the Plink is having the main effect that the Plink is having is that he'll back roll taunt twice. One from a specific other input and then once from the main one he's in. Because he can always do that. That right there is more so the situation we're referring to, where Dan does basically wake up and you aren't close to him, you're wondering what to do here. This is another one of our bots where the better you get at doing the things the bot requires, the more the animation timings of the bot will change, and the stronger the bot's approach to things will seem. This is particularly true if you go for your confirms and don't manage them that well. We do have some intent of trying to improve the amount of time the bot spends blocking. But mostly that is about timings and how we explain the timings. So the inputs will probably be the same. We're going to experiment with various timings, and by Sunday when we release the bot page, there may be some more specifics about how to get the timing such that he blocks a little more often after moves like that one. One important thing is that Dan is actually -2, basically checkable. It's you get to press a button, usually a medium one. He can uppercut you, but you can press a medium button after Dan rolls forward and taunts you, if you are forced to block it. You also do the same thing after those moves there, which is again why we called it whiff punishing, or rather we should have called it whiff punishing and didn't. But he also gives you opportunities to get the confirm by attempting to quote-unquote punish his attacks. And you must also judge things somewhat by range, because if you use something like Kareem's crouch medium kick, which is in fact quite, well, relatively slow, he can actually press attacks to get through this. He just can't do things like throw you. Similarly, if he taunts in the middle of the kick, the same thing will happen. And that gets even more complicated because then he's manipulating the range for your counterattack. It is perfectly valid in terms of the point system on easy mode to punish the Dan Retsuken, the punch, multi-punch, with your crouch medium kick or crouch medium punch and still count it as a point. If you're playing decently well, then this isn't going to be the primary way you get points anyway. And doing so helps the bot change its rhythm and helps you to improve. In other words, the more you do manage this punish, the less he'll actually do the move, so it won't matter. Plus, the move does have some relatively interesting feeling for its frame data. So despite being -10, you actually have to work pretty hard, if you're not too familiar, to actually use one of your really long animation moves to start a punish here. If he's well spaced, sometimes you can't do it at all, but this is only very specific characters. Among his other options are to cancel the Gadukin he's throwing. And of course, all of this way, he's building up V-meter to do all of these things with. In fact, if you find yourself waiting for Dan too much, you probably have more training to do. Which is why, past the easy version, as we often put it, you no longer take the point when you hit Dan with your crouch medium punch or medium kick from blocking the Dan Retsuken, from blocking the multi-punch normal special. But you do get points for that every time. Your goal, therefore, is to try to work your way in on this character, react when he does something to keep you away from him, and keep on following him for that chase down when he decides to keep on running away, more or less. Bearing in mind that even though your character might have fairly strong options for getting into position, Dan's rhythm can lead to you getting countered. In a long session of play, you'll probably see the uppercut only maybe 4 or 5 times, but he does have it. He has both the EX version and, I believe, a medium version. To try to explain exactly when those trigger, again, would be very difficult, but they're in there, and they will unfortunately surprise you fairly often. Certain characters see them more often than others, again because of rhythm. But it's again the same thing. The better you are at dealing with Dan and the things he's doing, the more likely you are to see more of the options the bot is doing, because he's no longer following the obvious flows. He's no longer doing one move into another move in ways that are defined just by this plays into this. There's some animation cancels, some extra moves in there, little timing things, or even just changing the animation timing of the back dash and forward dash will result in him doing different things. Similarly, it's possible for him to do a jump that actually attacks even in this form. You should just always try to anti-air Dan, but presumably, again, if you are at this point, you probably have faced our Ken bot or Ryu bot and done a bunch of anti-air training with bots before, and Dan isn't necessarily the one you need to do it on, therefore there's no points related to this. You should still, of course, anti-air Dan whenever he jumps. Even if the jump is not threatening, in the bot version, in your input of it, it looks like the bot itself tends to function pretty well either way. In fact, this sort of helps because he can sometimes end up having empty jump throw instead. You should also almost always take the point, even if you do it as just walking up to Dan completely in neutral. But in general, you should not give yourself a point for the approach medium kick or approach medium punch if you do it on Dan's wake-up. If you would like to use Dan in that way and train meaties and similar things, you need to change his first input somehow so that he does an uppercut instead of the quarter circle forward motion at the spacing. However, this will usually result in him just doing uppercut too often, so consider it based on whether or not you've ever tried to input Jury Bot, and that might be a better option here. But let's go ahead and change it then to V-Trigger 2 and clarify what it is that you can get out of this even with the bot. Dan's V-Trigger 2 basically enhances his moves outright. But the moves it enhances are not the ones that this bot depends particularly heavily on. You get an enhanced uppercut, which again you will see very rarely, even in more specific attempts to get it, you will still see it fairly rarely. Or you're going to see it way too much, one of the two. Or enhances the fireball, but the way it enhances it you don't really care about. Fortunately for practice, you still get to get the feeling for how long Dan's V-Trigger lasts. What he does with it is still in there. But none of that is the core premise here. You can see here that the main thing one is aiming for is your own movement, understanding of movement, and possibly having to chase an annoying character around the screen while they do increasingly annoying things. Most of the work we put into this one, both in terms of research and in terms of flow, are based more so about making him able to use those annoying little tiny tricks of this precise spacing being a problem, or this precise backdash being a difficult. And we feel as if we've gotten it to the point where you will mostly see those even if you're not too precise on your inputs, simply because of the way the bot works. Most of the inputs, except for the first one, have relatively set timings, and therefore shouldn't cause too much shifts. In other words, you do them pretty fast, you don't really have a way to do them wrong without completely noticing, and therefore he should do almost all of the little spacing tricks that are important, similar to how our Urian bot does. But now let's look at this from the perspective of a character who doesn't really have the same sort of option. There are some characters in this game who basically have either too slow a crouch, medium punch, or medium kick, characters like Abigail, or who don't have a crouch medium kick that does what you need in this situation, let's say. And to throw extra difficulty on that, we'll be using that instead. In fact, let's go all the way to maximum annoyance. And put Dan in his silly costume. Colleen can absolutely hit with her crouch medium kick. In fact, it's one of the better ones for this purpose, but to confirm off it requires a lot more work. And she's not terribly good at chasing this character. You can use your specials, but he can get out of the way of them pretty easily. Any character with a similar flow, or certain grapplers, tend to have bigger problems. And as you can see, even if you're a little bit off on something like a crouch medium punch timing, he'll just roll out of that. So, while you can chase, you can reach him, he'll eventually corner himself since you have good throwback. It's not really the point here. Let's put him on this side again, therefore. Getting into range where you can just hit Dan with crouch medium punch, therefore, is work. It's not terribly difficult to get some confirmed, but it's not super easy. Fortunately, that move is longer range than you'd expect, and similar characters have this, where their crouch medium punch doesn't look super long, but you can reach further than you might think. So if your character doesn't have a good crouch medium kick, you might want to see this, or if you don't have a cancelable one like Nash, for example. For Colleen players, please note that that is in fact a mid counter. And as you'd expect, Dankyaku is a high. But here's a good example. Depending on his spacing, you can't actually throw him after that roll. Some characters can always get it, and command grab characters who think the opponent is definitely planning on this and won't just backdash, you could definitely put some effort in, but if he's decently far out and rolls, you can't grab him. You have to step forward to grab him, which could put you at risk for any number of other things, and so on. So here we're going to go back to, I need to get close to you without being terribly annoyed, and hit you with my crouch medium punch. And I'll demonstrate why exactly this changes his rhythm a lot. Particularly if your move isn't innately a knockdown, and also doesn't give you a big advantage afterwards, which is again why we're picking Colleen for this. Dan will do a lot of relatively stranger things after it, that you basically have to react to in real time. And this is partially the reason for that dash up Gadukin moment. You see the little changes in rhythm as he is now. Honestly, it'd be much easier to just hit him with the regular stand medium punch and then combo from there. So while I'm using her for the demonstration of the totality of the idea, this isn't necessarily something that you as a Colleen player need to be able to do. Literally easier to just punch him in the face. It leads to that which is generally better for what you're trying to do. But again, the point here is to show off what happens when you can't necessarily count on your medium kick or crouching medium kick for damage, because while you can often hit a medium kick to deal with Dan, you still have characters like this one, where the medium kick isn't going to do the job for you per se. I believe Ibuki's was changed recently, or we would have used her. This is also a good way to train yourself not to dash at opponents just because they backed away from you. And even more importantly, not to jump. Dan's Koryukin doesn't necessarily go that much further forward than these characters' types in general, but he's a more slightly forward, closer to Ken than Ryu, for example. But I think basically the heavy one is about the same for all of them. But again, a lot of it is going to come up for this reason, and this is what I'm getting at. If you hit the crouch medium kick and you land the attack, one of the most dangerous things a Dan player can do is just do something completely random afterward. The bot is meant to embody this as well. If you either fail your input, fail your combo, or whatever along those lines, or you have a combo that doesn't work that well, or just have a move that doesn't cancel. You could try it as V-trigger cancels this way as well if you wanted to, because that still counts for the point in case it wasn't clear. So that would count for me. But even that is a rhythm change. He doesn't normally do the attack well enough to be grabbed by her counter. But I know that if I hit the button and he does a move, that was probably about to be a real jump attack. It's often his light kick when he does that. And there we have the Koryukin, which is built in currently as cross-up defense. I'm still getting used to this myself because I'm so sure that that move is supposed to be with heavy kick, not heavy punch. But I'll get there. hopefully everyone else will too, whether through using it or just, I hope you have success. He can straight up combo that as well, so please note that you won't always be able to get out of this. This is important because you do have to release all of the directions in order to use the V-shift. Meaning that you could either continue blocking without any chance of getting the V-shift, or possibly release your block in order to V-shift something that isn't going to V-shift. Fortunately, this won't usually matter because if he does it as a combo, it's a combo. You will keep blocking whether or not anything else happens. We're gonna do one more demo before I close out for the night. Please note, of course, that if you give him enough V-meter by hitting him, he will obviously do it more often. But you generally should aim not to just build up this meter because he'll just V-shift a lot of the time anyway. You're more likely to get what you need, specifically by trying to play out the scenario given. But this is part of why the point system works here, because he builds up the meter quickly enough that you can get a lot of practice. If you're a particularly aggressive player, you'll often find yourself in that situation. Nope, I'm not gonna stop hitting that kick. If you want Dan to do more Gadoken as a generality, you can get him to do some charged ones under certain circumstances by, once again, with action 3, holding both buttons instead of just holding the kick. You can also, of course, practice that sort of thing, but note that that specific move is actually really difficult to do this with, because it moves so slowly that you might not actually even get through. So feel free to use it to practice the ranges at which you can actually do that. Obviously for characters like M. Bison and so on, it won't even help you, because the super doesn't reach far enough forward. So while they did make a big deal out of it showing that off with Nash, Nash and Colleen, and to some extent Chun-Li and Ryu, are the ones where that will matter. Everyone else is just, okay, yes, I could do super, but will it really help? As far as I know, even Ed will not, in fact, be successful. But we could look at that and see what we get, as Ed is the next person for this demo. And our final 5 to 10 minutes before we close out. This is one of those bots where we really have, or really want rather, feedback from the community about what they use, what they change the inputs to, and what isn't working for them when it comes to this bot's inputs. This is particularly so because Dan has so many different ways of approaching matchups, probably more so because he's limited in his options. Or rather, let's say limited in his approaches. There are specific ways that the character needs to fight things, but could use all of the tools given just at different times. For this, we often will need to look into how to change the timings of the bot so that he actually does those at those times, so that a given player or a given character, you can really see the benefit of training with it. So of course, let us know if you've got anything in particular, and with your permission we will add it to the website as a variant or as an in-depth explanation of why it works that way, what they could be doing differently to help out a specific character type, or even literally a specific character, because this can come down to even little things in frame data that are going to be a big deal eventually. Characters like Ed, for example, who have to worry about distance a whole lot. Might be better off with minor tweaks to the way Dan behaves, so that he, for example, does less forward roll, maybe. Or uppercuts more, possibly. So, since most of the inputs are actually fairly clear in terms of timing, if you do change any of them, as long as you only change probably one or two, especially if one of them is action 1. Unlike many of our bots where I'd have to like see something or try to figure out what exactly you did with all the rest of it, it would not only be fairly easy to test without doing a whole bunch of changes, it would also be fairly easy to just visualize what differences were made by anything you chose to use. So as we always say, please go ahead and change action 5 to whatever you need it to be for your character. And in this case, technically action 1 more so, I guess it's actually been always true. Action 1 changes more so based on your skill level and what you need to train at certain levels of skill. In this case, both are active. If you need to deal with a lot of jumping stuff or a lot of tendencies that you have that you wish Dan would counter better, action 1 is probably the one to change. And if you've got some special ideas about how he specifically annoys your character, you can do a lot of changes to his action 5. as while they're important, it's only more so important that you do something. And unlike our usual bots, it's not necessarily that important that you do something similar. The core of the bot is literally the core, 2, 3, and 4, will mostly get you through everything. The others require there to be something, but the very specifics of that something are not as important. In fact, that leads us to the one other useful thing you can do here. So I'm going to have, just if I change this to have only actions 2, 3, and 4 on, and also to change Dan's V skill and V trigger. And this is why we needed Ed for this. Ed is the character where this is going to matter, and you'll be able to see it the best. The others are usually going to be trying to poke Dan a little bit too much in specific ways. Now, Dan will absolutely lose access to his stand medium kick. So what I said before about needing the CPU if you want to train the whole V skill 2 stand medium kick thing still stands. But a lot of this, as you're seeing it now, aside from still taunting quite a lot, which you really can't get away from, this is what you'd get if you, as the core, if you left off everything else. You'll just hit some buttons, you won't jump, he won't generally use the Dankyaku, but you could get that by starting any input with the kick. And he can actually do the light one, he just won't have the, there it is, he won't generally have the timing to do it too often. And he'll still do most of the I am at exactly this spacing and throwing out either my heavy punch or medium Dan Mexican. So please, use this for whatever you can. And the fact that the 2 inputs we've just turned off are technically the hardest ones, hopefully will help clarify what I mean and make it a bit easier to understand how to be creative with the other bits. If you wanted to work on a Dan bot that worked with this, if you're high level and you still want to use our bots, there are a few people, but really don't see the point of chasing Dan around the screen because your character would just beat him up from long range or something. This is still a decent start point, and contains most of what you need to mess around with and still get full access to everything he needs to do. Preferably without overcomplicating your own goals relative to training. And of course this also means that if you found yourself thinking this character does way too much taunting and rolling and backdashing, when none of the Dans I fight play like that, you can turn on action 1 and not 5, action 5 and not 1, and get all sorts of other things, even if you don't change 1 or 5 to something else. We won't be going into that on this stream. As mentioned before, we are trying to keep it shorter. And it's already gone over the 90 minutes, barely. As far as I know, we have no data on the release date of Rose, and therefore the next time you get any bot content from us will be hopefully a week after that. And noting, of course, that this one actually technically works even if you held the trigger button as a whole in Action 3 rather than just holding the kick. So he doesn't really need to do that long punch, it's just that he'll whiff throw a lot in neutral if you don't. Hopefully the concept of the stream didn't turn out too disjointed. It was relatively difficult to figure out which parts of this to talk about because Dan is actually full of depth in this game. All sorts of crazy things happen. All sorts of crazy things may need to be trained against, and we had to pick the ones that seemed most relevant. You'll note that he doesn't even do any light punches or medium punches as a standard thing. And those have their own levels of importance, but once again, we can count on the CPU for at least some of this. And hope for the best otherwise. As always, you can join us next Monday for more Street Fighter content, specifically our mashing or mix and mash battle lounges that happen every Monday. Tuesday content, unknown. We might still be working on variations of Danbot. Depends on how the weekend goes. We generally don't stream on Wednesdays. Generally consistently stream on Thursdays for our Dead or Alive content. And Fridays is reserved for this sort of thing, which means that next Friday you can expect to be back to no stream. Enjoy your weekend, both this one and the next one, therefore. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. You can find all our bots at 2-mk.org. You can find all our tweets and information about when we will stream, or if we're streaming that night, on our Twitter 2_MK_FGC. And our most recent posts, other than the announcement of this stream, should be basically for other streams earlier in the week. And if you go back a little bit, you'll find a thread with the prototype Danbot, which is basically what you're actually looking at because the prototype didn't really need changing. So you can input that either from this stream or use it as a reference to not have to go back into the stream to find the inputs, while you wait for the release of the bot page itself on Sunday around this same time at 2-mk.org. If you're interested in bots for other games, you can find them in the same place. Just use the navigation or input the commonly used acronym for the game, except that we have not updated our UNIST bots to unclear bots just yet. That's all for now. Good night, everyone.